On one of your slides, you said that housing was to kick up big time. If you could just expand on that comment.
Yeah. I'll put it the way the government doesn't put it. The way the transmission mechanism monetary policy is supposed to work is that you keep interest rates really low, you basically increase house prices, and you price the first homeowners out of the market. And then they have to go out to the outer suburbs and build. Now that is starting to happen a little bit, but the big increase is apartments. And they're all multi-storey apartments. As I said, a lot of them are money coming out of Asia and particularly China. The way you sort of think about this is for the last 20 years, for every apartment that was approved, 4 houses were approved. Today, it's 1 for 1. So there's this massive build-up of apartments that have been sort of in the line and they're coming. And so if you just look at that, you get something, we think something like 12% increase in total housing construction. So there will be part of that sort of, the miners that are sort of going to lose their jobs from constructing mines will move into the building industry. I was a bit surprised that the government came out with something like a 7% increase rather than our numbers, which is 12. But basically what you've got is and you have examples where a developer will basically buy a block, build, let's say, 100 apartments on it, and market it purely in China. And these things, you might argue about whether that's doing anything good for the social infrastructure of the country, and particularly if they don't turn the lights on. But they're actually going to build these things. And so that's going to happen. And so that's the big driver of that.
Great. Other questions from the floor? Nobody.
Does this reflect the interest in the budgets in
Maybe
things
so.
for this year?
Maybe Tom has them mesmerised.
Could I just make a comment that Tom's picked up on? I had it on my slide. When I was in Treasury for 15 odd years, everybody in Treasury used to say you cannot have a large gap between the top marginal tax rate and the corporate rate. And that was one of the tenets of tax economics. And over the last few years, that's just sort of been given away. And I get really worried because if you make the top marginal tax higher and the gap becomes bigger because you're cutting the corporate tax rate, you're just going to incentivise people to basically go away and talk to their accountant and figure out ways of getting around it. And so I actually think that's a really big structural problem. And you've got themselves into a situation where they earn so much money out of this top marginal tax rate, they can't afford to cut it. So
that was Tom's point, I think, that it might not be short-term.
It's also, Alan, you mentioned the, whether or not building apartments and selling them to offshore buyers, mainly Chinese, is that, does that benefit the economy? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But let's be honest here, and there's probably a lot of people in the room who are tax advisors or tax accountants, but advising people on how to change their tax relationship with the federal government is one of the most economically useless things you can do. Like, it creates nothing. And its end goal is to pay, well, it keeps more money in your pocket and less money in the government's pocket, but the government is trying to work against that. And all I'm saying is that I just looked at that and I remember maybe it was 2 governments ago, maybe it was under Costello, maybe it was under Keating. I just thought that narrowing that gap used to be a goal, and somehow through the imposition of levies, which are supposedly temporary but probably aren't, and now this cut in the company tax rate, we've just gone in the opposite direction. And you won't increase the company tax rate again. And it'll be a brave government that says, let's let rich people pay less tax, however rich is defined. So I just don't see that changing.
Yeah, look,
I'd agree. I mean, GST is a classic example. GST represents about 6% of the real economy despite its 10% headline rate. I mean, there's clearly some structural reforms got to happen there. A 49% tax rate gets us absolutely in the top 10 of global marginal rates. Congratulations. It's just not right in terms of trying to get an incentivised country.
Absolutely right. So we might finish off again. I'm conscious that we want to finish this. Oh, hang on. We've got a question from the floor.
Just a question for Alan. What factors do you look at in terms of forecasting the Australian dollar, and what's your view on those factors?
On the graph that we put up, I actually use an equation that we used in Treasury 20 years ago. So the things that really matter are basically commodity prices, because the world sees us essentially as a commodity producer and how much income you're getting there. The interest rates and the relative performance of the economy, so GDP, if you like, or the levels of unemployment, and something that's becoming increasingly important is what we call the VIX, which is sort of a volatility index, but really what it is, in layman's term, it's called China. Because what you've had in Australia in the last couple of years, people look around the world and they say, okay, this is a country that is seriously AAA. It obviously doesn't have a debt problem. It is completely linked to China, and it's paying interest. And so there's been this massive movement of foreign central bank reserves into the Aussie dollar. Now that's sort of stopped, but they're the key drivers. And as we look forward, our expectations that Australia is not going to perform as well in the domestic part of the economy, at least, as the US, says to us that it has to go down a little bit at least. It's an interesting, I've come back a couple of weeks ago from the US and Europe. The interesting question that was posed to me by hedge funds was, well, you look at Australia and you see a fiscal position that by global standards is brilliant. And you see these massive increases in exports that pretty soon are going to mean you're going to be very close to a current account surplus. And so when you look around the world, what you typically sell off is you sell countries that have large current account deficits and large public sector deficits. So why would you sell the Aussie? So that's an interesting dynamic. I think what's really happening as we go forward, things that really matter tend to be commodity prices, etc. That model I just talked about, though, is only good for plus or minus 5 cents. Okay? So it's not a trading model. It just says where should the dollar be? And if you look at it today, it says 92 plus or minus 5. And recently, well, a couple of years ago, it was the plus 5 because of the central banks. Then it became the minus 5 because people were worried about what's happening to China. And then the central banks weren't buying anymore. They didn't sell, but they weren't buying. And so we shot down to 88 or whatever. And now we're sort of back in the middle. So they're the sort of key drivers for the currency.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? No? All right, I might finish off just with one to Tom. So Tom, you gave us a list of the cliches that were spoken about last night, and purpose with pain was one of them. Certainly in speaking to business customers over the last 12 months running up to the election, a change of government was something that was welcomed, but also stability of government. So do you think the coalition government can sell this to voters?
I think this is going to be a very tough sell. Tony Abbott in opposition made a big thing about, Julia Gillard lied about the carbon tax, and then when he got elected, he said the adults are back in charge, and that was playing to his audience. The problem is, the issue of new taxes or increased taxes is in most people's minds, rightly or wrongly, a broken election promise, and it's very hard to come back from that. People have been trained to believe, partly by Tony Abbott, that a promise is a promise is a promise. So I think from a business perspective, as I said before, they'll think this is fine. But from the average punter out in the streets, well, essentially, Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey have now got 2 more budgets to try and rebuild their trust with the electorate. I must say, they knew that breaking this promise would cost them in the polls, and depending on what poll you look at, they've lost between 4 and 6 points. Now, no politician likes to do that, especially not in their first year of office. So all I can conclude is that if this, from an average punter's perspective, was a tough or a broken promise budget, the next 2 will be anything but. So hence my comments earlier about I thought I'd see more heavy lifting in this budget, because I don't think there can be much heavy lifting in the next 2 budgets just from a political perspective. So it's going to be a tough sell.
Great, thank you. Well, that brings us to the formal conclusion of our event this morning. I'd like you to join me in thanking David, Alan and Tom for their insights this morning.
Thank you.
We've actually got some fact sheets online, so if you go to www.nab.com.au/Fed budget or talk to your banker, you'll be able to get, again, copies of our commentary on the budget, so encourage you again to speak to your bankers. And again, thank you for your time this morning. We really appreciate both US customers coming along today, and we wish you well for the end of the financial year. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy.